To finish off our chapter on the treatment of psychological disorders, we're not actually going to talk about the specifics of how any kind of treatment works, at least not anymore. Instead, we're going to focus on how we actually try and evaluate and quantify the effectiveness of those treatment strategies. Because obviously, if we have a treatment that's meant to try and help alleviate some of the symptoms of all of the different disorders we've been talking about, we would actually like to know that they're successful in trying to treat those symptoms. So we're going to look at different strategies, how we know that they work, and also some of the considerations and concerns that are going to run in the background. Because as I'm sure you can expect by now, when we're looking at a whole bunch of different types of treatments, and there's lots of variability in terms of how they're delivered and with whom they're being employed, it's kind of hard to try and quantify effectiveness. Now, before I go in and start talking about a whole bunch of our different sort of concerns and considerations, I first wanted to take a look at this visualization that is actually showing us a very important concept when it comes to our clinical studies. And this is specifically a meta-analysis. And this is saying that we're looking across multiple different studies. Meta-analyses are specifically pulling data from multiple sources. And that lets us make some broader conclusions from that data simply because we're having larger data sets. We do have to have some special considerations when it comes to meta-analyses because they have to have been studying fairly similar things using fairly similar methods. But we're ignoring most of that just to say that this is a great example of a meta-analysis being used in an environment where they are very useful to allow us to look at the effectiveness of an depressant medication. So here we have the ADM as antidepressant medication, and we're looking at their improvement in their scores related to depression before and after they had received the drug. We also have another important concept here, which is a placebo group. And the placebo group is going to receive a placebo or a sugar pill. Basically, something that looks kind of the same and has the same sort of qualities as the antidepressant medication, but has no medical effect. So it's not going to contain a drug or anything like that. So usually sugar. So in this, or I guess originally when they were first developed, nowadays they would have no taste. I suppose I should clarify. All right, and so our diagram here is showing that this blue line is showing our net improvement. These are just a score in terms of how depressed the individuals were when they entered the program, so lower versus higher. And then the change here, so the higher up on this axis, the better. So we're seeing that the line for our drug, our ADM, the green one here, is a steeper line. And the flat line, or the blue line here, is a lot more flat. That's for the placebo. So what this tells us is that overall, our antidepressant medication worked better than the placebo, especially in scores sort of in the above 18. So anything above that, that tends to be the higher line. So we see a greater rate of improvement, but the placebo line is actually still positive, which tells us that even under the conditions where they're only receiving a sugar pill, something that has no medical effect, we still see an improvement in their scores. So they are less depressed as time goes on. That's an important thing to come back to. But one more thing I wanted to point out here, beyond the fact that A, this is a meta-analysis, and B, we're seeing this particular trend, and this interesting part about placebo effects, I also wanted to focus in here on the fact that each of these little dot points, larger dots mean that more people had these particular scores, smaller dots is fewer people. So this would be very, very few people, and this would be like very, very many. But that lets us see that there's tons of people in this area who are both orange and purple, so both placebo for the orange and purple being the antidepressant medication. So there's a lot of overlap here between the two, where it could be really difficult to tell just from looking at their level of improvement whether they had taken the placebo or the actual experimental drug. So that overlap is something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit, but a really nice sort of overview to get us started. Now, first off, in that graph, we were able to look at a specific measure of depression. So this HDRS is technically called the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. We don't really care about that part, But what we do care about is that is a standardized score that quantifies how depressed someone is at a given moment. Having that kind of standardized test, that survey that's going to give us a number that we know what it means based on how that test was designed, that can be really useful when trying to quantify improvement, like we see in the graph. But when we're trying to determine the effectiveness of different kinds of treatments, we don't always have an existing standardized test that can be used. So that's actually one of the things we need to keep in mind is what exactly is it that we're going to be looking at? What symptom are we trying to measure? And how are we going to measure it? So first off, if we want to talk about the measure that we're actually looking for, what is it that we want to quantify? If we're looking at do our treatments help, uh, what are we looking at the treatments affecting? So what are we calling helping in this situation? Maybe we have improvement in a specific symptom. We might go even broader and just say, is there a changing diagnosis? Does the person go from having a diagnosis to no longer qualifying for that diagnosis? Do we want to maybe look at some measure of how much better they're feeling, though that probably ties back to symptoms? There's all sorts of things we could choose to try and look at when trying to make a determination of is a treatment actually effective? So a lot of times we have to specify exactly what kind of a measure is it that we're looking at. And when we're trying to look at those measures, how are we actually going to quantify and collect that data? So a lot of times we end up looking at self-report data. So having people take a particular survey and looking at their results. We might have a therapist giving a report saying that, they behaved in this way on intake and they were behaving in a different way at the conclusion of their therapy. Um, but of course, we've talked before about some of the limitations when it comes to self report. Things like people might not have a reliable recollection of their own experiences, or they might not be truthful in the moment. When it comes to therapists, it might also have some bias to it, specifically because if this therapist is trying to show that their own type of therapy is effective, they might overestimate how much improvement has gone. And it might be intentional and it might not be. The same thing works with researchers of any kind. We sometimes have biases where they're going to answer questions or interpret data in a way that's closer in line with their own existing beliefs or theories. That also holds for therapists. And there's all sorts of other types of measures that we could use, but it all depends very much on the type of therapy that we're looking at, the types of therapists, the types of clients, what symptoms we wanted to look at, and all of these other things. And if there are so many different possibilities in terms of what we could decide to study or measure or not, we also think about things like that meta analysis, where I kind of snuck in the fact that to be part of the same meta analysis, multiple studies have to be looking at fairly simple, similar measures, and their methods must be fairly similar for us to consider them together. That means that if there's lots of variation and very few people are using consistent methods, it can be very challenging to try and compare across multiple treatments or even within a single type of treatment. So, all of this to say, it actually becomes very, very challenging to get a concrete piece of evidence that tells us that a treatment is likely helping in a given situation. So, what are some of our issues? In practice. And we'll actually look at sort of a more controlled scenario in a moment. But in most cases, when we're looking at sort of interpreting whether people are getting better or not, a lot of times we're not controlling multiple variables. Oftentimes, this would be something like people go to a therapist. Maybe it's something where within a particular company, they want to collect data on all the clients coming in and seeing how they've improved when they leave. So we could have an intake form and an outtake form, and we'd look at their scores across those. But these are going to only be the people who are coming and seeking treatment from this particular company. They're going to have chosen to go with different therapists depending on how they get assigned. It's probably that they are given the choice. We are going to have all sorts of things like what else wouldn't they control? Socioeconomic status. If your company is located somewhere that's hard to get from public transit, you're unlikely to get individuals from low income areas. So there's all sorts of things that we wouldn't control for, and therefore there's a lot of potential confounding variables. We also have to acknowledge the fact that we've stressed a lot that the therapist is going to have qualities that are going to make them better or worse in terms of implementing certain treatments. The client is also going to be more or less open to using different kinds of treatments, but there's also the interaction between the two. Basically, you need the client and therapist to click, where a therapist might be super effective with one person because they happen to think in a way that works together well, but another person might come in and get nothing out of that same therapist just because something didn't quite work for them. So these interactions can vary dramatically depending on a whole bunch of other factors. And again, other factors we might not be controlling or measuring. So things like looking at diagnosis and treatment strategy, as well as the attitudes of both the therapist and the client, all of these things vary on a case-by-case basis. So even if we were controlling for, say, only looking at individuals with depression, so we have the same diagnosis, are all of the therapists and clients combinations that we're looking at, are all the therapists using the same strategy? Are all the clients going to be open to that specific strategy? Are all of their symptoms the same? Because even if you qualify for a diagnosis of, say, major depressive disorder, not everyone is going to have the exact same symptoms. They can vary in terms of severity, in terms of having some symptoms but not others. So there's all sorts of moving parts here. When we're starting to look at the therapeutic effects, basically, is there an improvement, whether it's in symptoms, overall mood, whatever? Like I said, very difficult to quantify. And then, like we said at the end of the previous slide, who is it that's actually measuring these outcomes? If it's the therapist who's been implementing the treatment, they have this sort of vested interest in you having done better, and therefore there's bias in those outcomes. If we use maybe a standardized test and it's all self-report and it's run sort of outside of the therapist's hands, there's still the potential for bias because, well, who's decided what questions we're asking and so on and so forth. So there's all sorts of things to consider there too. And again, because we're trying to quantify things like symptoms of depression can be things like the thought patterns, overall mood or emotion, engaging in certain types of behaviors. That can be kind of hard to quantify in a solid way. So we are keeping in mind that this is a very big challenge. What else do we have to worry about? We have the natural improvement of a client. So this is something where if you're familiar with some of the statistics terms, you might have actually encountered something called regression towards the mean. And this is exactly what natural improvement in the text is referring to. So this is a tendency for symptoms to return to their mean or average level. And that seems kind of weird. Why would it return to a particular level? But if you think about it, we'll stick with the example of depression. So someone who's seeking treatment for depression in the moment, for a bunch of the reasons we talked about earlier in this chapter, are likely going to be seeking treatment when they're in a very deep low. So they probably waited until their symptoms were really severe and they're having an awful time. So they've finally given in, they've decided to go and seek treatment. But they've acted at the lowest point. They acted when their symptoms got really bad. Over time, our symptoms are going to get better or worse. There's natural fluctuation. And so this regression toward the mean says that there is some average score, an average mood for an individual. And if they were at an extreme low, then it's likely that over time, their score, their mood will get less and less extreme. They're going to get closer and closer to their average mood rather than the extreme low that was happening when they started treatment. So if we're just looking at how that person went from that extreme low to returning to a more average score, you might interpret that as being due to some kind of treatment, some kind of therapeutic approach. But it could also just be the fact that as time passes, scores tend to get less extreme. So this is one of those cases where we can't make a causal claim saying that treatment is causing this improvement because the two might be sort of co-occurring. So they improve naturally because time has passed rather than because of the treatment itself. The next thing to concern ourselves with is the placebo effect, which again has come up before, where placebo effects are focused on the fact that when a placebo or a sugar pill or some kind of non-treatment imitation of a treatment is actually implemented, we see that the expectation that something will help actually leads to it helping. So if you give somebody a pill that has no effect whatsoever, but you tell them that it is a painkiller and they're experiencing pain, their report on how much pain they're experiencing will decrease after that pill was taken. So even though there's no actual pain-killing properties within the pill, their expectations that it's going to help made it actually help. And so when we're looking at things like people seeking treatment, they're usually finally seeking treatment because they expect that doing this is going to help improve their symptoms. So what that means is their expectations that it will help means that it is much more likely to help. That's one of the reasons why when we were looking at our graph here, we saw that our blue line for our placebo is still showing that positive slope. They're still showing improvement. So what that tells us is the fact that the expectation that this should lead to an improvement was sufficient to lead to improvement. So is it that they're getting better because of the actual treatment or because they expect the treatment will help? We can't really pull that apart unless we have a very well-designed study. And then the last point, reconstructive nature of memory. Now, this is interesting because if you've taken 104 and remember back to the memory chapter, we talk a lot about the fact that human memory is constructive or reconstructive, which basically means that every time we pull a memory out of storage, every time we remember an event or think of something that happened in the past, we're actually able to make small changes, whether we mean to or not. So in this case, when we're saying that our clients want for symptoms to improve can cause errors in memory for the original symptoms, it's basically saying that we have sort of this expectation that we're getting better. And so when we think back and remember the times before we came to treatment, we almost end up overemphasizing the badness of those symptoms. So because we want now to be better, we remember before as being worse just because that's more in line with our expectations, with our current thought patterns, and because our memories are very flexible, that's exactly what happened. Now, I did hint at the fact that if we had very controlled studies, we might be able to be a little bit more certain that treatments are what are causing improvements in symptoms. I will stress that not all of these are going, or not all of the studies that you encounter are going to be experimental. There's tons and tons of ethical reasons for that. Things like you can't just give drugs to some people but not others when they're sort of in need of treatment. But we have some workarounds for that. So we're going to talk about randomized clinical trials. For our cases, you might see these called treatment outcome studies. I'm specifically using randomized clinical trials because they're trying to look at the outcome that follows treatment, but they're trying to do it in a controlled manner. So we're calling them clinical trials because we are looking at clinical treatment options. And the randomized component is where we're trying to take this from just being a correlational study, where we're just measuring, say, befores and afters of people going into treatment, things like that. Here we're saying we're randomizing the individuals getting assigned to different kinds of treatments or different controls, and we're going to collect actual experimental data. So this is a little bit different and very rare to actually encounter in the real world. But our goal here is to try and evaluate the effectiveness of our treatment in comparison to something that has meaning to us. So in that initial graph, we looked at the treatment, our drugs, versus a placebo as our comparison group. But we could have other kinds of comparison groups here. So you could compare versus no treatment. So people with depression but who refuse to seek treatment versus maybe people who are receiving antidepressants. We then have our placebo control where they'd receive a pill and be told it's antidepressants, but it isn't. But we might also have something that works in sort of that ethical concern area where you can have some other effective treatment that we already know how effective it is. So, for example, this would often be something like, here's the standard and most widely accepted antidepressant drug. We know that it's effective in these situations, we know how it works. So, what we're going to do is we're going to have a randomized clinical trial where our control group or our comparison group is actually people experiencing the original trusted drug, the one that's already understood, the one we already know its effectiveness. The new group is going to be given a new drug, something that we don't know how effective it is, but our comparison is going to allow us to determine, is it more or less effective than the existing treatment? If it's more effective, fantastic, we found something that might be a better way of treating depression. If it's less effective, then it's not really going to be very helpful. It might also, though, be helpful if it is equally effective as the current standard, because then we found a new alternative that could be used. So having another effective treatment as our comparison group can be really useful. But this note that random assignment is not always possible refers to ethical considerations, but also the fact that you can't make people choose to pick certain kinds of treatments. So you have to sort of do the best you can within limitations. But we're not going to get too much into sort of the research design part of it. Again, another concept I think we may have discussed before, but we can talk about it again, and this is establishing a double-blind experiment. And here, we're going to just keep everybody in the dark. The client doesn't know what group they're in. The therapist or the researcher who's delivering treatment doesn't know which group the client is in. We're trying to make sure that nobody knows what's happening, and therefore we're trying to reduce the expectations that could be involved. Because if the client knows that they're receiving treatment, then they're going to anticipate or expect that they're going to get better. If they know that they're in the control group, then they would expect not to get better, and that will affect their behavior accordingly. If the researcher knows which group the person is in, there's that potential for bias in terms of their interpretations of the data, the measures they get, but also the researchers might behave differently towards the clients, which can itself then influence their behavior. So by using a double-blind experiment, we're trying very, very hard to reduce the possibility of bias from having that existing knowledge by making sure nobody knows what's happening. When we think about it, of course, there's going to be lots of guidelines if we're conducting a randomized clinical trial. Specifically, we want to control as much as possible. There's already so many fluctuating variables, and it's already so hard to try and quantify human symptoms and how much improvement is being observed. So they try and standardize things as much as possible. The procedures have to be followed exactly by the letter, which usually involves extensive training on the side of any staff that's involved. So the researchers, whoever's going to be carrying out delivery of treatment, it's all very strongly controlled. If we have therapeutic sessions, so talk therapy, we would have the sessions either taped or observed so that somebody else can be making notes, or so we have some kind of record to make sure that nothing was going on that shouldn't have been. We try and keep that double-blind component to make sure that we're not sort of having bias and expectation influencing. We usually want to have some concrete standardized measures if we can. And typically more measures is going to be better because you're not always certain what you're going to see in the outcome. But obviously there's a lot more we could talk about here, but these are just some things to keep in mind. And then just for a kind of brief visual, this I borrowed from another source, but this is looking at a meta-analysis once again. And in this case, they actually combined almost 400 different studies that were trying to look at different types of psychotherapy and how effective they were. So here we're going to see, so the percentage where somebody improved over the average, more than the average control patient. We don't have details on what that control was, but we're going to see, all right, how many people were better off than a control patient. In some of these, they are more effective than others, but they're all showing a pretty decent improvement. So our Gestalt therapy doesn't seem to be performing as high as the others, but all the others are pretty reasonable. Because we don't have specifics on how they measured this or quantified this or anything like that, we can only take this at face value that says, yeah, they seem to be doing better than a control patient, so it seems to be effective. That may be due to expectations that therapy of any kind should help improve, but it's at least leaning in the way that treatments tend to be effective, which makes sense. And that's been supported in multiple different types of studies. In more recent studies, we're seeing that probably, let me see, what do I have here in my notes here? I wrote out the specific quote. So it's saying, modern studies show that the typical psychotherapy client is better off than 3/4 of untreated individuals. That's not too far off from what we're seeing here, where 3/4 would be about here. Or actually, it's saying 3/4 of the other, whatever. The visuals on it doesn't matter. What we care about for this is the fact that clients undergoing psychotherapy tend to improve better than those who are not being treated. So that's the important part. That's the part that we want to take home from this. We've been stressing the fact that there's a lot of variation in terms of how effective things are, and there's a lot of moving variables involved. So it gets very hard to get a hard number on exactly how effective a certain treatment is or which one is the best overall, because there's a lot of interacting features that are going to make it better for some people and worse for others. But overall, seeing that therapies tend to help is really good, and it is why we continue employing the therapies that we do. We do have different types of treatments. It's typically fairly challenging to have new treatments break into the market, mainly because we need lots and lots of studies that need to give support that shows that they are effective in those conditions. And we need to accumulate enough evidence before those treatments become widely accepted. So, this here is talking about the fact that when we're trying to have these empirically validated treatments that are supported by research, we have some that are well established, meaning that we've collected lots of data on them, they've been used for long periods of time, and we have lots and lots of studies that show that they're effective. But then we have these sort of probably effective treatments, which is saying that we have some preliminary support, we've had early studies that are showing promise, but they haven't been in circulation long enough or don't have enough studies conducted that we are positive that they're very effective. So these might become established in the future, but it takes a long time for them to become established. Now, this is another sort of interesting diagram here. So this is from 2013, but what we're looking at are a couple of common disorders where we've been looking at similar treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy or similar, and where we have studies that show some results that give us evidence that our treatment methods are effective. So there's lots of symbols here, lots of sort of short forms. So PT just means our psychological treatment. CBT is cognitive behavior therapy. Meds is going to be our medications that are related. So here we're saying that when looking at depression, there are studies that found that our psychological treatments and medications for the disorder were equally effective, but having both of them combined was more effective than either on their own. We also find that here they have a psychological treatment was the same as medication when they ended treatment, but when we have follow-up, so after the treatment has ended, they found that the physical, oh my goodness, psychological treatment. I keep seeing PT and think physical therapy, but the psychological treatment was actually better for long-term effectiveness. And then, of course, both were better than a placebo, which is important to note. But this is just sort of showing that pattern where in a lot of these cases, we're finding that our psychological treatments are effective, our medications are typically effective, but we can also have things where the interaction, so both being even more effective than either alone, or things like one is better short term, one's better long term. There's all sorts of different things that can be going on here. So rather than specifically knowing exactly how this study found psychological treatment versus different type of person-centered therapy in terms of effectiveness, we just want to acknowledge that there's going to be a lot of sort of moving parts and a lot of complexity in situations like this. Of course, anytime you talk about psychological treatments and how effective they are, people are pretty quick to point out the fact that there are potential dangers with using psychotherapy. So one thing to note, we'll start off with the overall, we're seeing that trend that people tend to do better when receiving psychotherapy than without receiving treatment at all. So that's our big take home. There are things that people can point to where there's potential risks, potential problems that can come from therapies, especially therapies that have been used in a maybe non-advisable way, but that's its own thing. One thing the textbook mentions is something called iatrogenic illness, specifically where we have symptoms that are going to have come about because of our either medical or psychotherapeutic treatment. So this would be an instance where receiving treatment has actually created new problems. And that is a possibility depending on the person and the scenario and the treatment types and things like that, but it's not very common. We also have sort of tales of implanted memories. So this is mainly looking back at very, very early history in psychology when they were trying to understand the unconscious mind. So a lot of sort of Freud leaning, and then other researchers at the time realizing that memories are not as solid as we thought they were, in trying to help people maybe overcome traumatic childhood events, ended up asking leading questions that created a false memory of traumatic childhood events. That is something that did happen, but there are lots of ethical considerations in place nowadays that tries to help prevent these types of things. We then also have a note about concerns around labels, where labels, or our diagnostic labels, can actually end up changing both the individual who has received the label as well as those around them. So this is something where I might have mentioned earlier the fact that many therapists don't actually apply official labels, and there's a whole bunch of debate about whether, say, an employer has the rights to know if you have a particular diagnosis. Stuff like that can tie in here too. But the idea being that if you receive a diagnostic label, there is the chance that you will change and modify your behavior to come in more in line with that particular label. Basically, we have certain assumptions about what traits or qualities someone with that label has, and to try and keep things congruent or matching, we tend to adjust our behavior to be more in line with that particular label. This can also lead to others treating you as if you fall in that label and fulfill all the different sort of assumed characteristics or stereotypes associated with it, which can actually end up creating equivalent behaviors. So effectively, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where being labeled as something makes you more likely to behave in such a way that makes you look like you belong within the label that you have received. So that might be a bad thing, it might not be, but it's just something that gets raised often. So when we're looking at our dangers, there are some things that can be brought up and have support behind them as possible concerns. Some of them were more of a concern in the distant past. Some are still concerns. But our big thing at the top here is the fact that, yes, typically they're going to be they're going to be better than not getting treatment at all. And I've just noticed I've been gesturing to this point. I changed this point right before I started recording. I had intended to do what I had been talking about, saying that overall, therapy is going to cause more benefits than the risks of detriments. But I still have my slide here that says that therapy that leads clients to develop beliefs that do more harm than good are possible. So all the gestures and all the referring to that point and talking about the fact that we typically see that treatment is going to be more beneficial than it is harmful, that is still true. But pointing to this point and saying that was a mismatch, and I apologize. This point is saying that we do have some therapists or some therapies, sorry, also potentially therapists, but some types of therapy can lead to sort of dangerous mindsets. It can lead to more problem behaviors like this type of illness. There are the potentials that it can cause harm. But most of the time, when we have sort of ethically approved types of therapies and they are being carried out by trained professionals who have sort of licenses that have certain standards that they are held to, we have a lot less likelihood of those therapies that are causing harm. So it is always an ongoing process, and we're always learning more and making changes to have the most effective types of treatments. But it is still possible. It's just not something that we see as often as people might worry about. All right, now before I point and talk about stuff that I shouldn't, we can continue on ethical standards for treatment. As I've been saying, we have lots of ethical standards that apply to providing treatment. And these you're going to find are a very strong overlap with what we've had in our methods chapter, talking about ethical standards within the APA. There we go. So these are going to be very similar to those APA standards, just kind of broken down into how do these relate directly to treatment and treatment approaches. So respect for dignity of persons, that's still going to be a big role here. So this is where we're saying we want to make sure that we have those special considerations for people who are vulnerable. So individuals with psychological disorders are definitely going to be a vulnerable group. And you need to make sure that if they are consenting to treatment, that they are actually able to give informed consent. If their diagnosis maybe makes it so that they don't understand what they are consenting to, you might have to seek sort of approval for treatment from other sources. We also have to start looking at things like, all right, these need to be fair, the treatment needs to be fairly distributed. We need to try and avoid biases in implementing treatment. So those are all really important things. We also stress the fact that we need to be responsible in our caring efforts. So we want to make sure that we are doing things that are going to benefit clients and taking care not to cause undue harm. So this is why it's said at the very beginning, where we need to keep in mind that if everyone in our study has a disorder, it might not be ethical to withhold treatment for some of that group. So if we had a placebo group where they get no treatment at all, is there potential that that's going to cause them long-term harm? Are their symptoms going to get worse? Is this going to affect their day-to-day life if they're not actually treated? That's why we'll often see a comparison between, say, an effective treatment and a new treatment, because then we're not withholding treatment from any one group. So that's something to keep in mind depending on the scenario. The integrity is also still a concern here. We want to make sure that the studies are conducted well, that we're avoiding biases. We want to make sure that things are accurately reported, honest and truthful in how they're presented, all sorts of really important things for all types of research. And then the end here, we have a responsibility to society, which is basically saying that when we have this psychological knowledge and we're actually starting to use it, we need to use it for beneficial purposes, basically to stay in line with those three principles. So this is saying we're going to be doing things in a way that is full of integrity. We're not going to be, say, hiding the truth or being dishonest. We're going to show respect for the dignity of persons. We're going to make sure that the vulnerable are protected. We're going to make sure that we have equal distribution of benefits and responsibility for caring. We're going to make sure that we benefit people and not cause undue harm. So all of that's going to tie together in terms of how we employ our treatments as we understand them. So lots of nice wrap-ups where we get to pull from a lot of earlier topics, but also just sort of acknowledging the complexity and the difficulty in trying to understand which treatments are effective or not. So an interesting way to end.